But we have, Islam allows that flexibility for jurists to use their reasoning to look for different options to deter that case for murder. So what is Islam's position? I don't think Islam really has a black or white position where it's either for or against. I think it's taken on a case-by-case basis. And the general rules are that I mentioned here, that in general, when there is a mass murder or something that harms society at large, Islam would encourage the state to take that into consideration. When it's at individual level, that goes back to thank you so much.
Thank you very much. So at this point, we'll open it up to any questions from the audience. So you can just raise your hand. Yes, sir.
Hello, Ms. Cashman. You said that there were 21 cases that are currently being reviewed. You mentioned 21, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
My question is that because there's only 21 cases, or is it because there are 21 cases that are being reviewed because they weren't decided unanimously?
There are 21 cases that are at a point in the appeal or in the post-conviction where the appropriate thing, based on the most recent case law from the Florida Supreme Court, is to vacate the death sentence because it was not unanimous and set it for a new sentencing. There are more people on death row, but their cases may be at a different point in the appellate pipeline, and they may later come back. I don't know how many death sentences have been imposed since Ring was decided, and I will tell you that it is rare that there is a unanimous jury recommendation for death in the cases that I've seen over the past 30 plus years of doing death penalty work.
So follow up on that, Ms. Cashman, what happens to those ones that you said the prosecutors would determine if they still want to go with death penalty? Do they get retried?
Their penalty phase will be retried. The actual conviction will stand, but what they will get is a new sentencing hearing to give the state an opportunity to present aggravation and the defense an opportunity to present mitigation in front of a new jury who, in order to be death eligible now, must vote unanimously to sentence that person to die. Now, under the old system, judges could override a life recommendation. The jury could vote life, in fact, vote life unanimously, and a judge could set aside that verdict, if you want to call it that, and impose a death sentence.
What are your thoughts on controversy with Governor Scott basically removing the elected official who decided that you can pursue any death penalty? I think I know the answer, but people on the panel would really speak to what's happening currently right here in Orange County.
I know that our state attorney filed a lawsuit. I've seen some of the executive orders entered by Governor Scott. One of the concerns that I have is, what if we have a state attorney who decides that they don't want to pursue marijuana cases anymore? And there are many jurisdictions, as we know, that it is no longer a crime and that it's just a sort of civil infraction, like a speeding ticket. And if a state attorney's office makes that decision and makes the decision to issue notices to appear, not arrest those people, is what they're going to do in their jurisdiction. I think that people have much stronger opinions when, well, the governor took away these cases because she wasn't willing to pursue death, and we think she should pursue death. I wonder how those people would feel if it was a marijuana case, and should, I think that the courts in the end will tell us, you know, I can invite personal opinion and stuff all day long. Nobody really cares for the most part, except sometimes when people like you ask me at events like this. I think the question is much broader, and I think that the question, and the courts will give us the answer, is does our governor have the right to take away prosecutorial discretion from an elected official because he doesn't like what the result is? Certainly there are those who believe yes, he does. Well, if you answer yes, he does, at what point then? Can he only do it on death penalty cases? Does he get to do it on those marijuana cases? You know, for instance, we have a program called pretrial diversion for first-time offenders. And the idea is have first-time offenders suffer consequences, take classes, do community service, report into someone once a month, pay a fine, and in exchange for successfully completing that program, the state attorney's office here no crosses or drops their charges to give people a second chance, to have them not have a record, and we all know how difficult it is to get a job, to find a place to live, to move forward if you have a record. What if the governor decides he doesn't really like giving those people pretrial diversion? And I give you those examples because I think that it is a question that certainly our courts need to answer. I know that everyone expects me to say, oh, the governor's wrong. I don't know whether the governor's wrong or not. I don't know enough about it. I think that it is important that the courts decide, and I think it is important when the courts decide that they look to not just did he have a right to take those cases away, but what right does the governor have to interfere in prosecutorial discretion, and where do we draw the line? And I think that that's a question and an issue that should be of concern to all of us as citizens, and should be of concern not just in the death penalty arena, but you know, when does the governor get to step in? Traditionally, governor assignments are made and cases are reassigned because a particular state attorney's office has a conflict. For instance, the elected state attorney's cousin gets arrested and charged with some sort of fraud. Well, you know, that office shouldn't prosecute that case because there is the appearance of impropriety. And you want to make sure that it's handled fairly and it's handled objectively. Does the governor have the right to reassign cases because he doesn't like the decision that a prosecutor is making? Should the legislature be taking away funding that was earmarked to prosecute human trafficking cases because the legislature doesn't like that the prosecutor is not going to seek the death penalty? And I don't think there's clear-cut answers, but I think the courts will have to interpret what the laws are and look at the facts and circumstances of what occurred and let us know what is appropriate for a governor to do and what's overstepping the governor's bounds.
Anybody else?
Pastor Lasich, I believe you said that in the New Testament, nowhere in the New Testament does it say that capital punishment should be abolished, or shouldn't happen. My question for you, with the case that you brought up, of the adulteress, wouldn't that in itself be a statement from Jesus in saying that no man is without sin, therefore capital punishment shouldn't be?
No, not necessarily, because you can make the case that Jesus saw the injustice that was taking place right before his eyes. The woman's caught in adultery. The last time I checked, you don't do that by yourself. Where's the guy? Okay? So immediately you've got an injustice going on that I think you recognized. And it was not being brought to him as a legitimate question. It was being brought to him in order to get him to make a statement one way or the other that would get him in trouble. So what he does is he applies the Old Testament principle to the accuser. Remember, the accuser had to be absolutely certain that what they were saying was true, or they would face the same penalty. So I think what he's doing is putting it back on them, saying, we all know that what you're saying here is not just. So are you willing to face the punishment that is going to come your way for the injustice? So I think what Jesus was addressing there was the injustice of the system, and not making an explicit statement about, no, you should never be involved in a capital case. Now, that's dealing with that particular instance and not making a statement, overall.
So, on the slides, it said that there was over 3,000 inmates waiting for, to be executed. Does anybody on the panel know why they're not being executed? Like, why aren't they? The stats showed that there was a couple done. There very few are done. So why aren't 3,000 being executed? Anybody know why?
It's her fault.
Actually, it's the governor's fault. In death penalty cases, what our Florida Supreme Court says is that you should be given super due process. You should be given certain appellate rights that you would not otherwise have because the government is trying to kill you and take your life. A individual who's sentenced to die in Florida is given a direct appeal to the Florida Supreme Court. And they can also appeal federal grounds in the 11th Circuit. And they can also petition for cert to the U.S. Supreme Court. And once they're through their direct appeals, they can then file different post-conviction motions. One of the things that passed in the legislation is this speedy execution law that was put into effect a few years ago. Once you've been through all your appeals, you have a right to clemency and to clemency proceedings. We have them, although I don't know that I can tell you the name of anyone that the governor has granted clemency to. And until you've been through all those proceedings, the governor can't sign a warrant. And he has general counsel and he has people who advise him. And then when the governor signs a warrant, there are additional pleadings that can be filed. When there's 3,000 and some people, we have states that have death rows that haven't had an execution in over 20 years because no warrant was ever signed and they don't move forward, and while they have that process in effect, they do not use it. In Florida, we've executed more individuals than any other state based on the slideshow that you saw because we have a governor who signs a number of warrants. While Hearst was pending, I had a client who was executed, who had a non-unique recommendation of death, but was not able to get a stay for the court to decide first. It's a process, and where you are in the process dictates when a warrant can be signed, and we have some governors who sign a lot of warrants, and we have some governors who don't, and, you know, there are people that have been on death row since the 70s that are still there. I have a client who went to death row in the mid-90s who was executed over a year ago. Why did the governor sign a warrant on him and let someone who'd been on death row since the 70s continue to live there? I don't know. Perhaps you can ask him. I don't know that he would answer if I did.
Piggybacking on that question, can you speak to the current case in Arkansas where they're trying to speed, execute these 7 inmates? And for the religious speakers, can you speak to the morality of that? Because as I understand, they're speeding up the cases with execution because of the supply of the poison. That
You know, I think that as the other two speakers said, there's always a moral aspect to the death penalty. And doctors have what their Hippocratic oath says, and they have a moral opposition. In certain countries that used to ship those drugs to us will no longer ship those drugs, such as England and Canada, because they are against capital punishment and don't want them used to kill people. I, as a human being, am appalled that we would want to execute 9 people in 7 days or whatever the ridiculous numbers are. As a lawyer, I can't imagine what it's going to do to clog the courts in Arkansas with last-minute pleadings. I read an article about psychologically the damage it's going to do to the people who work in the prison and will be required to participate if we are trying to rush them through because of the availability of drugs. Shouldn't that send up a red flag? Shouldn't that tell us that there's something wrong with the process? Even if you believe in capital punishment, perhaps there's something wrong with the procedure by which it is carried out, and maybe that should be addressed. I think it raises a lot of different questions. I understand that some of those individuals have gotten stays, and that maybe 2 of the stays were lifted. I can't imagine why we would need, as a society or as a country, to perform that many executions in that many days when we have so many issues that are being litigated right now. And, you know, are we afraid those people maybe didn't get a fair trial or fair sentencing, and we might have to give them one if we didn't kill them next week?
Yeah, I think I'm not familiar with the details of the case, but just to point out and just to reiterate that the process itself needs to be a fair one. It needs to be a very clear and unambiguous case, and I think the real effort of the government needs to be preventing murder. Where does murder start? It isn't. That's kind of dealing with the end result. Someone was murdered, but what pushes someone to murder? Because murder, even psychologically, it takes a lot for someone to have someone standing before them and take a life. Many times we've become almost desensitized to murder or that human life. Sometimes you hear on the news that 150 people died in this place, or 20 people died here. It's just a number. But actually, each one of these people is someone who had a favorite food, a favorite TV show,
what we really want to do as a society is prevent future murders. And one of the statistics that has been studied is after an execution, the homicide rate goes up. And the point that you made about the whole desensitizing people to violence is something that we should be more concerned with. And if we want to say, well, we kept that person from murdering anyone else, okay, well, you did, but is that really what we want big picture wise? And I think that those are two really important points that need to be looked at by society in determining whether we continue with the procedures that we have for execution.
I think the whole case goes back to the issue in Arkansas is not the morality or lack thereof of capital punishment. The issue in Arkansas is the justice in the system or not. You know, as been said, it seems like there's a rush to do something here. And why? Because once you execute somebody, that's it. If they're still alive, there's always time to do whatever it is that you're going to do in the end anyway. So the rush to judgment, as we talk about, it seems like that's what's happening here for reasons, who knows what they are, supply, whatever it might be. But I think also what we're looking at is we're talking about 8 cases as if they're a monolithic thing. Each of them have some individual character to them. I don't know what they are. I don't know what the nature of the conviction was. I don't know what, are we talking about first-degree murder of an individual, or are we talking about somebody who, slaughtered a dozen people? Just what all's happened here. So the case-by-case basis, is obviously part of what's got to be dealt with here, and not this whole monolithic thing. But it's still, to me, it does again come back to, is there ever the time when the taking of a life through capital punishment is a moral thing to do? And that's the harder thing to wrestle through. People can get different spots on that.
Any other questions?
I don't have a question, we keep talking about the rights of these criminals. I mean, they are death organs and kill somebody. What about the rights of the victim that is not dead? They have favorite TV shows, they have family, they have favorite meals, but they're not able to speak of it ever again. So we're realizing who's looking after them. They're dead, they don't want to have right. People on death row for committing this crime, but worry about what their favorite meals are and their family. I mean, they have family that's correct, but they're the ones actually committing these crimes, and without a doubt, they committed these crimes. Why should they have rights if the victim doesn't have rights? Their rights are wrong too.
Victims do have rights, and you may not know this, but in Florida we have a victims' rights statute, and it addresses next of kin of homicide victims. Victims have the right to be heard, the right to be notified of proceedings in court, and sometimes our victims' statute works, and sometimes it doesn't. There is a woman named Suzanne Bosley, and she was present in the church that her father was the pastor of when he was murdered by a man that he had tried to help. And Suzanne spent years, and this was not a local case, this was a case out of another jurisdiction. Suzanne spent years trying to convince the prosecutors in the case that her father would not have wanted the man who murdered him executed. And the prosecutors didn't listen to that victim and said, no, we know better. And so there's an example of where, and she tried to tell a jury at one of the proceedings, and the prosecution wanted her held in contempt. So sometimes that whole, the victims have a say, the prosecutors who very much listen to the victims' families and listen to whatever closure they want or what they want to see happen or that they don't want to go through a trial. And I think that, like any other situation in life, there are times that victims are heard and there are times that victims are not heard. There is a process by which they can be heard. There are groups that support victims. We have a local group, Bereaved Survivors of Homicide. There are groups such as Victims of Murder who are for reconciliation. So you have, just as we have a room full of people, some of who are adamantly in favor of the death penalty, some of whom are adamantly opposed to it, you have that same sort of spectrum when it comes to victims and what their wishes are and what they want to be heard on. You know, the people on death row, they have a right to a fair trial, and they have the same constitutional rights as anyone else, and there's a reason that we all decided that, because we want people to be treated fairly, and we have laws that give victims the right to be heard and the right to have input, and we should. But, you know, be aware they do have rights, and just like people who aren't victims, sometimes they don't get to exercise those rights, sometimes they do, and I think we should all work towards making sure that that is made known and that they get to exercise their right no matter what their belief is.
I think what you're addressing is the issue of the value of human life. When we talk about the rights of the victims, in all due respect, you're talking about the rights of the family and friends of the victim. The victim you're talking about is dead. And so what is it for them that in any way makes a statement about the value of their life? And I think this is where we're starting to get to the more question of it, that if someone, let's remove all the mitigating circumstances, there's no doubt, whatever, it's a full confession, whatever you need to know that this person, with all kinds of forethought, maliciously went and murdered this other person. What are we saying about the value of the life of that murdered person if we say there's no possibility of forfeiting what you took, forfeiting your own life in that? I mean, it's interesting that in other cases, let's say I stole your car. Not only do I have to return your car, but I'm going to be punished for stealing your car. It's not, we don't even see it just equal, I give you your car back. I somehow have to suffer something for it. But those that would be in favor of capital punishment would say that if you are going to murder someone, to require anything less than your life is making a statement about the life of the person you took as not being as valuable as yours. And I think that's where the debate really becomes an issue. It's easier for us when we talk about massive numbers. Nuremberg trials. A group of people responsible for the killing of between 12 and 15 million people, whatever numbers you want to come up with. Well, yeah, okay, their dozen or so lives, or however many it was, as against the 12 million, world opinion was pretty much saying, yes, that needs to go. Their lives need to be ended. But now we get down to, well, what number do we say? How heinous a crime do we say? And my concern is that when we get down to just one person on one person, that we're saying, oh, that one person's life is not as important as the dozen, or the 30, or the whatever it might be. And that's where I think we get into real difficulty.
Sorry. Is there a fiduciary, I guess, reward or for a state to hold on to death row inmates or whatever? Like, is there money being made by a state by holding on to someone that is on death row? For instance, you were saying I was a little bit late coming in, but a slide that says there's 3,000 in the U.S. that are on death row that are still waiting, whatever those years be from the 70s, from whatever. All right, is there money being made to hold on to them and not sign a warrant?
Not that I'm aware of.
Other than the taxpayer?
Sometimes the signing of warrants is political. I don't think there's anyone that can disagree that it costs a lot more money to sentence someone to die than to sentence them to life in prison. I know of no economic benefit in keeping those individuals alive rather than executing them.
Do the prisons housing the inmates tend to receive funds for those inmates, or a different set amount for those?
Not that I'm aware of.
And then I kind of have a part 2 question. Does, amongst the panel, would having harsher punishments for lesser offenses be a way to deviate people from doing harsher crimes? Or do you think the issue is, you were saying that when someone is sent to death row and is given the death penalty, that crimes increase? Do you think that has a correlation to possibly the length of time that those people were on death row, so people get it in their mind that, well, I can do this, and then I may or may not get the death penalty, and then even if I do, it'll be 20 years from now. So if the process was refined, even though I do agree that someone who is deciding